not everybody who has been abused in their childhood will go on to abuse others, but everybody who abuses has been abused themselves. I think that if that is correct, and this is what the experts say, well, then, I think the perpetrators deserve our attention. But unfortunately, it's a very difficult place to go, naturally, for anybody. But I've come very much around to that view that if we don't begin to look and try and help the perpetrators, the cycle will never end.
Okay, I'm joined here by Tomás Hardiman. Now, before we start today's episode, I just want to give a heads up. All right, so today we're going to be covering quite sensitive material, and for its concerns abuse and particularly childhood abuse. So, if this is content that you feel might be difficult for you, I just want to give a heads up about that in advance. And the second thing is we're going to be covering Tomás's excellent documentary, The Days of Trees. So we're going to be covering a lot of content that's actually in that documentary. So if you don't want to spoil it, then you might want to listen to this after. All right. Now, with that said, Tomás, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. To get started, could you just give
Ah,
us a sort of a broad outline of the story that's covered in The Days of Trees?
yeah, well, you see, it was a very long journey, and it never, like all the best journeys, it didn't end like we thought it would when we began. But so number one, like, I produced the film, and I work with a brilliant Irish director, a very well-known director who's done loads and loads of stuff, very prolific, Alan Gilson. So I've known Alan for a long, long time, but we've also made four documentaries together. One on the playwright Tom Murphy, which was back in 2004, and then a documentary on Ivor Brown, the psychiatrist Ivor Brown, which is called Meetings with Ivor, and that came out in 2017. And then that was followed in 2018 by a film called The Meeting, which concerns a restorative justice meeting between a woman who was raped and the man who raped her. And this took place after he came out of prison. So that was 2018. And then we were following on with a film which we wanted to do, which concerned my own childhood abuse in a Christian Brothers school, which didn't fully come to my notice. A lot of it was in my consciousness, but a lot of it wasn't. And so I was about 56. That was like 10 years ago when this really started to break for me. So we were looking for a way of approaching telling this story, perhaps as a drama, or perhaps as even animation or whatever else. But there was never a situation which was envisaged that I would be actually in it myself. But just to cut a long story short, that's the way it ended up. And towards the end of COVID, we went down just as an experiment to do some work on the documentary, start shooting some stuff in Glenstall Abbey in Limerick, and that really ended up being the backbone of the film. So the film, even though it's produced by me, also I'm the only one in it. So that's kind of hard to believe that such a film, people would be looking at a film for 90 minutes with just one subject, but it seems to have worked very well. So I hope that answers your question.
I went to see it in the Irish Film Institute a few months ago, and it, it was a really hard hitting, emotional. It was a roller coaster, and I left it, and I was shook, but in a good way. It really brought to my consciousness things I had never really properly considered before, and it really asks some big questions. So it's a really really interesting watch. Um, for you, whenever you were, making this and producing it, was there anything in particular you hoped people might take away from watching it?
But you see, but like my deepest concern was how was I going to do this, and also that the entire enterprise, the entire project would be a mechanism for healing, you know. and you see, I know, obviously, probably as a producer and stuff, I know that if an audience is looking at something unfold, it's far more compelling than something that's, a story neatly told. Even though most good films, the stories are not neatly told. I know that, like Beckett always said that, art was never clear. There's nothing clear about art. It's something that's unfolding in front of your eyes. So to tell you the honest truth, all I would have hoped was that if this film ever got finished and ever came out, that it would be one that would bring about my own healing, but also help other people who may have been in a similar situation as me to heal also. And of course, we know that there's like 1 in 4 is probably what people say, 25% of the population have experienced or have experienced.
Wow, wow. That's a really interesting phrase, a mechanism for healing. So, one of the questions I was kind of curious to ask you going into this was, what are your thoughts on this idea that our own personal suffering at the right time, if we can harvest that, it can be something that can benefit others. And if we're able to do that, that it can actually be quite a meaningful path for ourselves. Like, what has been your experience of sort of harvesting these really intense emotional experiences for yourself and putting that into a documentary and then sharing that with the world? What's that been like for you to do?
Well, it was obviously very difficult. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. And it's interesting. I was the one who said a mechanism of healing, but then again, mechanism of healing kind of denotes some mechanistic process, and of course, it's far from mechanistic. Except for when you're making a film, you've got to use machines to record everything. But it was something that. I think a lot of people may relate to this. People who actually are really grappling with childhood trauma have this almost compulsive need to tell their story, because the whole difficulties arose in the first place when, I can only speak for myself, but when I was in a position where I couldn't speak and was in a kind of a trapped situation for an extended period, because it wasn't just one teacher in the school. There was a number of incidents. And so, this is a really interesting question because people talk about historical abuse, and I remember I took great offence to this. I wrote an open letter in the Irish Times in 2016, to the head of the Christian Brothers, the Superior General. But I said, there's nothing historical about my abuse because the suffering at the time, but as a small child, I wasn't able to comprehend that it was in fact suffering because I wasn't in the world long enough to know how things worked.
Yeah.
And then later on, I could see that I was having difficulties in my life, just with normal living, which I couldn't locate the source of those difficulties. They eluded me. And yet I knew I was kind of running. So I was doing all sorts of things that included isms like workaholism and alcoholism and all of these other things. They kind of came with the territory for me as I went on. So clearly there was suffering in that as well. But I certainly now believe at this stage, and it's a long time since I suffered from alcohol or whatever, but it's it's a continuous suffering. But I can say now that, I mean, life itself is suffering, And I'm not the first person to say that because I think it's in a Buddhist text. Um, but the, I just feel that I am extremely lucky. One of the reasons I made a film on this was because I could make a film. I'd already made a number of films, so I knew how to help, with the help of others, like to pull together a film. So, you know, the suffering, the film offered me a way out of my suffering. Maybe does that make
Wow.
sense? And that's
Wow.
that's probably why I did it. But of course, as I'm trying to say to you all the time, that I never really knew what I was doing as it was going along. It's just that we were moving along, and I had the amazing good fortune to have somebody like Alan Gilson, and who's my close friend as well as a close professional collaborator for a long time. A very sensitive man and a very talented artist, you know. So I had the benefit of that all the time. I certainly couldn't have done it, you know, without him.
This makes me think a couple of things. So this was a choice that you made, and you could have decided not to do this. And I just wonder how different your life might have felt or been if you had have refused to do this. Like, do you think there would have been a cost to that? Do you think that there would have been a sort of nagging existential guilt of not releasing this into the world?
That's such a great question because the thing is, you know, you could easily ask the question side by side with that, and I will try to answer both of them. But you know, it's like you're screwed if you do, and you're screwed if you don't. It's been in that particular place. That's how it felt for me. Because on the one hand, I had this compulsion that I've already described to tell my story, but at the same time, I had a massive fear of this story literally spilling out. You know, this is what because when that spills out, a whole lot of other things spill out, not just for me, but for a whole lot of other people as well. So it's a very, 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 very fearful uh, journey, that too, you know. So it always moved between, you know, so when you ask, you know, like the question that you asked, uh, kind of would probably suggest that there was a trajectory, you know, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. But the trajectory isn't this way. The trajectory is kind of all over the place. You know, if it's a thread, the thread keeps moving, and everything in relation to the thread keeps moving. So it's really, it really is. When you I think you just described watching the film as a kind of a roller coaster. So the making of it was a roller coaster for me as well. And I mean, at certain times throughout the film, poor Alan. I remember once I was over in. You know, it took a long time to make the film because it took a long time for it to come out because there were legal aspects that were brought into question, even though they weren't legal problems for me. They related to some other people, but you know, there was a point where I was away once, and I sent Alan an email saying it's off. We're not doing it. You know, it was already made, like it was in the can, you know, without the music on it. And I said, no, I'm gonna have to do it again with somebody else because I can't do this. This is my life. Like this isn't, you know. But I got over that because that was just a problem. I had gone away on holidays and literally, you know, in the day something kind of dawned on me. It was part of the process. I now know, but I said, no, it's not going to happen. But like within a day or two, you know, Alan and myself discussed it, as we always do. We get through all of these things without big dramas, you know. And it was clear to me then that I should go ahead, you know. And I mean, so
So part of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is there's a stage called refusal of the call, and it happens in
yeah,
every hero's journey, I suppose. So that definitely happened to you, and you refused it, but then you got back on track, which is fantastic.
it was
So
mad. I actually met Joseph Campbell once. Like when I think of this, like it was just a pure fluke when I was younger in my twenties, you know, and something that I was working on. But I am aware of that thing that you described, and he's brilliant. That all of these mythic, you know, he was the kind of world authority on myth, but all of these mythic stories come into play for anybody dealing with the subject of childhood trauma. You know, for the actual subject. We're surrounded by people who talk about it all the time, but what I have been trying to get across, and especially in the film, is what it's like on the inside for the person to whom it happened. And by saying that as well, I'm not dismissing for a second the other people who talk about it around, because they've been absolutely crucial in bringing the whole subject of childhood trauma into the mainstream discourse. But what interests me, it's just like, you know, if anybody is talking about addiction or whatever, I prefer really usually to hear somebody talking about it from the inside. But I don't not like hearing about it from the outside, because that's also important. That's also a perspective,
Yeah, we need both of those working together. And before we move on, I'm curious, what was Campbell like when you met him? Did you have a brief chat with him? What was he like as a
Very
person?
briefly, because I was just young. I was working on a James Joyce Centenary Festival in Toronto, University of Toronto, in 1982, which was it was Joyce's centenary of his birth, and there was a load of really well-known people that were at that. Like John Cage was there as well, Joe Heaney, the singer, um, and um, the thing is, I'm not name dropping because I didn't engage with him. Like he wouldn't have known who I was, but I'm literally just saying that I actually met him and I had to transcribe his talk um, afterwards. So I got very familiar with his territory. His wife Jean Erdman was a dancer as well, and she did a piece. But I'd be lying to you completely, and I'm not name dropping because I didn't really meet. I did meet him. I stood in front of him, and we may have shook hands. I was introduced or whatever, but I'm afraid I can't tell you any more than that because there was no more.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So the abuse happened. I don't know the exact age. You were quite young. Was it? You were around what, 7, 8 sort of age,
No, that,
roughly?
it was a bit later than that, and it was extended because, like, see, this is a very you know, when I say this is a subject that even after everything I've done, all the explorations that I've done, all the work that I've done on myself, there's still more opening. More is being revealed all the time as to conditions under which this happens to a child. Because you sometimes have to go back a little bit and you've got to go forward a little bit to understand. Now, I could get into all of this, but it would become a completely different
Yes.
kind of a story because it's so complex, and also I'm just learning it now, so I wouldn't be able to convey what it is that I mean. But I think I would say that I was inappropriately dealt with by 3 teachers
Wow.
when I was young. So one I was a bit younger, and one I was a few years older. So it was over a period. But I have said, that I did live in terror in school for a particular period. A quiet terror, because in the outset I looked fine. I was a kid. It's lovely. I heard even on your podcast, there's like I've listened to a lot of the interviews here, which have been up. I think they're completely illuminating. I love this podcast, and that's why I'm doing it. But people did talk about, when I was a child. I think maybe Parker Palmer spoke about it and Sean O'Leary, but about a child. A child is so all forgiving and so open and so curious that the child doesn't always read what is horrific as horrific, because there is this all forgiving quality. And this is why people, when it comes to sexual abuse and stuff, the whole idea of memory becomes very, very complex as well. It's not just a straightforward linear thing. And I think this applies also to, sexual abuse like rape that happens even later in life. All of these things become very shimmery gray areas. And again, you see in the
Sure.
film that the person who comes to the film uh, gets on the inside of this track. And I think in the film that we made before that, which was called The Meeting, this woman, Alba Griffith, an Irish woman, a very, very brave woman who wanted to meet the guy who raped her after he came out of prison, she plays herself in that film, The Meeting, and she confronts um, her rapist, and you can see him changing throughout the thing and her changing. So what I'm trying to say, I'm actually still going back to the child. There's always a child in us. There's always that part of us that really wants to forgive, that really wants to be open and remain curious, no matter what happens to us. And what I'm trying to say is that that can happen in adulthood and in childhood, but it usually happens in sexual abuse that we become frozen in some sort of way where we cannot really, really speak of it at the time. And it's quite hard to speak about it even later on. I'm sorry if I'm going on just a little bit, but I actually happened to see a film just this weekend in the Irish Film Institute, a Spanish film called I Am Nevenka, Soy Nevenka, Spanish. One absolutely wonderful. This is a feature film about a story of a woman, very briefly, who was sexually harassed by her employer, who happened to be the mayor of a council. She was a politician, a young politician and economist. And the story that unfolds there was a documentary made in a Netflix documentary series made, I think, back in 2021 or something. But now that this new feature film is out, but it becomes really clear from watching that film as well how people become completely frozen. They lose all their agency when there's somebody bearing down on them like this, right? So, and what I think about all this is this isn't just a matter of sexual abuse. This is a matter of what happens to people in society all the time. There are forces bearing down which render the other person completely powerless. So it can go into, I'm not going to do it, but you can go into any place there. You can go into even climate change in terms of the way we treat the earth, almost like abusers. And, the earth is kind of unable at some level to respond straight away, but it does eventually. And it will eventually with us as well. So I don't know if that makes sense what I just said, but it's kind of
No, it does.
a
It does.
circular thing. Yeah.
It's really well put. It's tragic when you think about it like that. So you experienced this as a child, and then am I right in saying that this didn't properly come into your conscious awareness until you in your 50s or so? Like it didn't, you weren't, it's part of you almost as an offense had blocked this out of your awareness and kept it hidden from you. And then you went into therapy and worked with a therapist, and gradually it came up. Am I right? Am I in the right
Yeah.
ballpark here?
The thing is, yeah, what happened, Niall, really is I was doing therapy on it 10 years before it actually did come up.
Wow.
So while I was doing that therapy, I described this in the film that I had actually had two really vivid dreams. There were lucid dreams, in relation to the abuse. So what happens, when we can't really put our finger on the actual event, what happens is our psyche throws up this kind of garbled, dramatic, fragmented set of images, which, kind of frightened, in my case, frightened the life out of me. But at the same time, I knew they were true. I knew there was some core truth in this, but it came out in a completely fragmented and garbled way. So I think the psyche does that first in order to maybe give us a little bit of a warning before we can then, Rilke talks about growing in, like things that you can't understand, like look at them as locked rooms, which you cannot enter yet because you wouldn't be able to understand what's in there.
Mm.
So you get this little bit first, and then later on, you kind of maybe get a key to the room, and you might open the door for a little bit, a tiny bit, and then another little bit, and eventually kind of go into the room and look around. So that's what happened to me, but it was a period of over 10 years, 12 years. And the first therapist I went to was Mike Frawley, who was the consultant psychotherapist that was there for me all through the film, the making of the film. But then the great psychiatrist Ivor Brown, who was a friend of mine for a long time before that, he was the one who really broke. I did some regression therapy with him, and he was the one who cracked the memory thing.
It's fascinating. And you're saying there that so whenever this did dawn on you that it had happened, was it a gradual realization, or was there a moment when you can remember and it was like, okay, this, and whenever it did dawn on you, whenever it did sink in, what was that like? Like what were the emotions you were experiencing at the time? What was your inner life like at the time that this was dawning on you? What this part of you or this child had been through?
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's been through the psychotherapeutic process knows that, even when I was doing the earlier psychotherapeutic sessions with Mike 10 years before the thing broke, there was a lot of stuff stirring, and there was a lot of emotion, and there was a lot of crying and everything. But it's a very good question that you asked, because what happened then in the sessions with Ivor, I think I probably had 3 or 4 of them. And it was like, first this little bit, and then another little bit, and then another little bit. So it is slow, because it has to be slow, because the psyche wouldn't be able to take the onslaught of the whole thing. And like Ivor, of course, was a very poor Ivor, the late Ivor, because he died in 2024, January 2024. He was a master at kind of handling the situation on this. He was just great. Like, I felt very safe with him. And so what comes really, Niall, with it is this wave of sadness, but it's gradual as well. But when you ask me the question, that's the one word that would come to me. So maybe over 4 sessions, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And then when I knew it, I wrote a memo to my little self at once. That I'm sure, I don't know where I have it someplace here, but I wrote a little memo to myself. At last, I'm hearing you. At last, you're coming out. And now, as my family hear this, because I had to ring all my family and tell them this happened when I knew for definite that it happened. Massive tears, maybe an afternoon crying, maybe an afternoon and evening. So massive sadness comes with it. But with that, with the expulsion of that emotion, it's followed on by a beautiful calm, I think. That was my experience anyway. And again, I wrote about it at the time, but um, like very poignant, but also very, very relieving, let's say.
It must have been. Oh, I can't even imagine, but I imagine there must have been a great once that you had processed it, and once you had you had done the crying, it must have felt that there must have been a sense of lightness, or the just a heaviness sort of leaving you almost.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. And by the way, just so sadness wasn't the only thing. There was also anger, and I wrote a very big, long poem. Your poisoned eyes. It was like it's a complete uh, response to one of my abusers. Um, it's an absolute rage and anger that comes also. You know what I mean? That's part of it as well. But they don't all come together.
These situations can be particularly tragic whenever someone is abused like this, and then they go and tell, say, their family about it, and people either want to keep it hushed or they don't believe them or whatever. What was your experience like? Were your family supportive? Were
They were
they?
really supportive. It was wonderful. And I think my brother, who died in 2018, and even in the film, I get very upset about that, because he had just died when Alan asked me to name my family. And it was the first time that I called out the names of my siblings and realized that one of them was dead, my brother, my one brother, because I had 5 sisters. But no, they were entirely supportive. And like my mother and father um, were like my father was dead at that stage, but my mother was very old. She lived to be 105. She was an amazing woman, amazing kind of strength. Um, but obviously, I spared her of all this news at the time, because it wouldn't have been fair to, it certainly had nothing to do with her. She didn't know anything about it, as parents don't. I feel so sad about the parents of people who are abused as well, because they have to take on such feelings of guilt and perhaps, neglect or something, when in actual fact, there's no way they could have known, when in fact, in many, many cases, the child themselves doesn't know.
For sure, for sure. With your work with Ivor, what can you share any insight on what the process actually looked like or involved? Like, what you said, it was regression therapy. What
Yes, yeah.
what
Well, actually, to tell you the truth, now the best way of seeing that is in the film, because Alan did a wonderful job of kind of recreating that. Now, the other part of it as well is that all through my life, and this was probably a function of the predicament that I was in. I kept diaries all through my life from when I was 14, and I still have them all. So this kind
wow,
of hoarding thing in diaries, this I've since learned is a kind of perhaps a symptom of the thing. But so I had, say, when I finished my session with Ivor, number one, I didn't want to go there with them at the beginning. I'm saying, you know, You know, when you say to a psychotherapist, yeah, you can ask me if you want, but like, fuck off. It's what you really said with all your being. But then, if eventually you can surrender and allow and go with the whatever process or psychotherapeutic process is underway, um, it then becomes absolutely wonderful what you uncover. But you're terrified all the way through. And then even, when a session to be finished, Ivor said, "So where are you staying tonight?" Now you're going. In other words, because sometimes you don't want to leave the room of a therapist because you've gone someplace where you've never ever gone before and think, I've got to go out onto the street. Like, are you mad? You're not letting me. But actually, the minute you take your foot out on the street, I remember this. Like, I remember leaving Ivor's once, and I walked down. Uh, to where there were shops and restaurants near where he lived. And I went in and I sat down and I ordered a meal and I really enjoyed it. And I felt totally secure because he was such a good therapist. He didn't, he wasn't just throwing me to the wolves. Like, he had actually gone through the stuff, but he had done it with such skill that, there was a topping and tailing where I kind of went in and came out and was safe to go. But there's all of those feelings attached, I think. And hopefully, I would be, when I'm saying this as well, I hope, that's not always everybody's experience, but it's such a difficult, difficult thing. One thing I will never, ever do is I will never be just baldly criticize anybody for this, that, or the other. This is a very inexact science. It's a very perilous journey that people take inside themselves. It's a very it's a very huge responsibility that psychotherapists and people who work with people have, and as human beings, we don't always come up to the mark on everything, But all I'm saying is, I was actually very lucky, with the therapists I had, and I can only speak for myself.
It's such an interesting image or way to look at it. You're embarking when you're starting through this work, particularly with something as sensitive as this, you're embarking on a perilous journey. So you've got to really tread carefully, make sure that you've got someone with you that you really trust, that you feel safe with, that is going to be there whenever it will get difficult, because it will get difficult.
Yeah. And it is, and it's often hard, you see, because you're entering into this and you're not sure about what it is that you're saying in the first place. It is very, very difficult to go to somebody else and say, "Look, I'm going to go through this. Can you help me?" In many cases, this is probably part of the whole hero's journey, the mythic quality of it. Not just like what Joseph Campbell was saying, but like if you were back in the in one of the previous ages, and you were walking around with a club in your hand and there were dinosaurs around, you didn't have anybody. You didn't say, "Well, actually, there might be a dinosaur around the corner, so will you stay with me and help me in case," you know what I mean? It's as kind. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's as bald as that. When you're going into these areas, um unless there's the other side of it, Niall, and this is a very interesting thing, and you could talk about this all day, but you see, it comes down to our belief system as well. And it also comes back to, maybe how we feel safe in the world. So that might bring us into spiritual realms of whether we think we're being looked after, by angels or by whatever our conception of God is and all this. But all I can say is, in my case, I called on all of those things. I think you do call on ancestors and you call on invisible forces to keep you together for these things.
So you find that was quite helpful whenever you were going through this, to have those invisible forces sort of at your side almost, or to
Yeah,
have that
absolutely. Well,
relationship.
not so much even that I was certain they were at my side, but I was certainly calling out for them.
Yeah.
Some people say, I have a very good friend who's actually a psychotherapist as well, and she always says that the best prayer is, "God help me." You know,
For
and it's
sure.
universal. I
Yeah.
don't know what God is, but I've often said, "God help me. Please, God help me."
And you've mentioned the mythic element a few times here. Was that did that play any role in your healing journey? And if not, no worries. But I'm just
Not at all. No, I wouldn't have. Like, I'm just. It's only after the event that you can describe it as
yeah,
mythic. When you're in the
yeah.
middle of it, you're really just going, "What the fuck?" You know.
You're
Is
you're in
it
the
okay to use the word "fuck" in this context? I hope it is. I hope I'm not
totally fine,
offending
totally
anybody.
fine.
Yeah.
You're in the underworld, so to speak, and then you once you're out of it, then you can look back down on what's happened.
Actually,
And
now that you say that, the underworld, I remember being extremely interested in Orpheus and the underworld, with the music and the opera and all that stuff, I would have been reading stuff like that because it gave me some sort of a reference point. And I mean, Dante's Inferno, all of those kind of things, they all describe these things. There's a guy called, I think it's Ian Vernon, who it was a brilliant book about Dante's Inferno, kind of from a spiritual point of view, which was really, really I remember reading that, and it kind of helped me a lot too.
is
The
that
nine circles of hell and all this stuff.
is that Mark Vernon?
Mark, sorry, excuse me, it's
Mark
Mark Vernon. Excuse me. Yeah.
Mark's a great thinker. So can you remember? You mentioned spells with alcoholism and uh, your earlier life before you sort of started doing this work in therapy and before you started processing this. Can you remember or possibly describe what your inner experience of life was like back then during those times? Like what was that like for you? Do you have any memory of that? Like
Like,
seeing
right,
your
right.
20s and 30s sort of time.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Now the thing about, I don't speak very often about alcoholism, but I'm feeling from what I've seen in all of these podcasts and this series, and this is the territory that you're in. So, I don't mind talking about that, but alcoholism isn't a historic thing as well, just like abuse. There's a continuum all the time. It's always alive. Like, but what I would have been doing, like, you see, as a society, we're only beginning to have the language to talk about this in a way, but you'd say, well, I was trying to mask it, I was trying to numb myself from the pain, you even hear this on the radio now. So, but like, there is no other way of saying it. That is what happens, you know.
Yeah.
And so if you talk about me in my 20s and 30s, like I was working extremely, extremely hard because there's this sense, I think, that people like me have as well, that it becomes workaholic and you begin to start taking responsibility for all sorts of things that you don't need to take responsibility for. You're not being asked to take responsibility, but you need to. So I think I say in the film too, I was burning the candle on both ends. Like I was working really hard and I was playing really hard. And that's all, that certainly was completely related to me kind of running from something that I literally just couldn't even think of facing, not knowing what
Did,
it was. Do you know what I mean? It's a dis-ease in the world.
did you have the sense back then that you were running and you just didn't know what from? You just had the sense that you were running.
Yeah, I wouldn't have called it running at the time. I just had a sense of dis-ease in the world. I was uneasy in the world in general, without having any knowledge of what the source of that unease was. Does that answer?
Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting way to put it. So then
And then that
not
makes you see, that makes you do all sorts of things that you're not even aware that you're doing it yourself. Like in my case, I'd be up singing at parties and drinking and doing all the things that any young fella'd be doing.
for sure. Um
There's still a
so
self-denial, I'm sure, anyway.
yeah, yeah. uh and so how does that compare with now? You said you had this sense of dis-ease in the world. Do you feel now that you've done this work and that you've released this documentary into the world? Do you feel more at home in the world now, would you say?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That was certainly an experience, and it was very interesting for me to be in the IFI the other night because the girl, Nevenka, was there, and the director and the actress who was in it. They did a Q&A after. And a year ago I did that same thing in the IFI. Myself and Alan and Brendan O'Connor did an interview with us on the day of the premiere. with Sinead O'Flynn in the Irish Film Institute. And like, I was shitting it that day, you can imagine, we did a Q&A. But here was I being able to look at this objectively last Saturday night in the IFI, and I could see Nevenka up there, and I could see all the things I could see come in her face. I'd experienced them myself, and it was just a joy to be able to get that perspective on it. So that gave me another perspective on the way I felt. I'm just saying, you see, oh yeah, what I'd really be saying, because you're saying, what's it like, did you feel at home in the world all of a sudden, as opposed to being uneasy in the world? And I would say yes, but then more is always revealed. So again, without going into it, just very recently, I met a very interesting man called Jim Cogley. He's a priest in Wexford. He's also a wood turner and a psychotherapist, very experienced man over a lot of years. So I just met him recently, and he's opened up another kind of other departments within that whole realm of children being abused, because there sometimes can be preconditions which make a child more susceptible, and they do say that, perpetrators have a kind of a laser. I think I've heard Gabor Maté saying that, or Bessel van der Kolk or something, they've got a laser instinct for a child that they can abuse, Now, without going into it here, but like at some level, because I have a huge interest in this, I am of the opinion, and it's clear from the film, that perpetrators themselves, they do say that not everybody who has been abused in their childhood will go on to abuse others. And I say, thanks be to God, I'm one of those. I've never had any proclivity or inclination, thanks be to God. But not everybody, but everybody who abuses has been abused themselves. I think that if that is correct, and this is what the experts say, well then, I think the perpetrators deserve our attention. But unfortunately, it's a very difficult place to go, naturally, for anybody. But I've come very much around to that view, that if we don't begin to look and try and help the perpetrators, the cycle will never end, And the cycle of child abuse is just, I can guarantee you, it's just as bad, if not worse, than ever it was, And it's something that dates back to the beginning of time, no doubt, So that's why we kind of say, well, it's too big for us, but we can't go there,
With your own abusers, how has your feelings towards them evolved over time?
Well, this will be very difficult, perhaps, for some people to believe, but, look at me when I'm saying it. I have no difficulty with them. As I say in the film, their healing is their business. My healing is my business. I've come around through a lot of pain, a lot of anger, a lot of everything, to really see that the only way, you see, I just believe that we're all one. We are all one. There's lots of other things discussed on this podcast series about, to do with consciousness and neuroscience, spirituality, everything. And I think it's becoming very clear to us all that we are actually one. We look out at the cosmos and all the atoms, and we can start talking about the atoms and go in search of them in the cosmos, but we forget that we are a bunch of atoms ourselves, And once in my life as well, in 2013 or 2010, for 3 years, I trained to be an Alexander technique teacher, And the biggest thing that taught me was, I went first to a workshop for a week. And when I saw one lady standing up, working with another lady who was lying down on a plinth, And when I saw that when the person who was standing up, she was holding the other person by the feet. And once she relaxed herself in her body, the person lying on the table visibly relaxed as well. And I remember seeing this and I said, I've got to do this. So I spent 3 years training to be an Alexander teacher. I don't practice it now, but I practice it on myself all the time. But the big difference with this is that I understand what it's like on the inside. I understand, anatomy. Say, for instance, if I were a doctor here in the university, there'd be a chart up here behind me with the body, the human body. And I'd say, there's the heart, there's the pancreas, there's the stomach, there's the knee, there's the shoulder, or whatever you see. And we're actually looking at it from the outside. But what I'm trying to say is experience that from the inside. Whole different thing. So it's just like, say, looking out to the cosmos and saying, it's made up of atoms and we better explore these and work them out and see what way they work and everything and forget that we are actually the same things ourselves. Is this making sense?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so it turns medicine and stuff like that inside out, really, because, you know, I had an anaesthetist once into me at one stage, and I did have the map up there of the human, but he was able to say to me, well, like, I only know that from the outside, and I'm saying, well, here's an opportunity for you to get to know it from the inside. So there's loads of of activities in the world that we can approach in that way. And I loved, for instance, like the Pope just died this week, wasn't it this week? It's still this week, was it? Or no, it was last week, last Monday. But it's just amazing, with Wim Wenders' documentary on him. It's so amazing. It was such a beautiful thing for me to see. This man is absolutely, absolutely beautiful man. But I never thought it until I saw the film. I saw him himself, because the church, the structure of the church, obscures. That managed over the 12 years to still obscure him. It managed to, it manages to kind of to tone down other popes that came before, but he was refusing to do that. Like he was closer to Jesus and Saint Francis, obviously, and was hell bent on living his way that way, even within the riches of the Vatican and everything. But it's the same thing. It's the question is, are you looking at this from the inside or from the outside? So I think if we have anything to do with Christ or anything to do with religion or whatever, first thing I would say that I'd want to do is try and experience almost from the inside how Christ was and say how he lived. Whereas we're looking at churches and religions and everything, and it's all based on outer material manifestations of things that ultimately, whether we like it or not, has nothing to do with Christ. And I could see that Pope Francis saying that. And you see, because you could say I'm anti-church, right? Like, I'm just like, what I am really is like, well, sorry, I shouldn't really be anti anything, but like, I suspect institutions and things that are man-made and built around who purport to, to convey a sense of the spiritual. So, and it's amazing the power that evil kind of lies in the collective. Richard Rohr has been talking about this recently in the last week or two, how evil can sit so beautifully into the collective, and so the collective keep the whole show going, even though it's ruining them. You know what I mean? And Mark Twain said as well, it's a lot easier to fool people than to convince them that they're being fooled. No, so we all know where that's going. We all
I
know.
like that. I
Yeah.
like that. Okay, so you've said something there, and you've sort of just said it and brushed past. You've said it offhand and sort of brushed past it as if it's no big deal. But we're talking here about you being seriously abused as a child by three individuals, and you have been able to properly forgive these people and have compassion for them, and you've it's helped you to arrive at this understanding that we are all one. A lot of people say that, and talk is cheap, but this is coming from a really deep place where you've processed a lot. So I think it's just worth emphasizing that. And I'm something that came to my mind that I was wanting to ask. If you could, I think you've already tried this, but haven't you tried to reach out to some of these individuals with letters? Would you be willing to share the kind of content that you were sharing in those letters? Like, what were the sort of things you were trying to communicate
I think
whenever
it
you
was
sent
there in the
those?
film, and anybody who sees the film will see I read a draft of one letter that I was writing that I didn't send. But what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to attack or hurt you. I just, maybe want to meet you. And I'm not alone in this. And there's absolutely no hubris in it. Or I'm not sitting back here saying, well, you know what, Niall, I'm some man. Like, imagine I'm able to forgive the guy who brutally, as you said, you were, abused as a child. This is just where the journey has brought me. Do you know what I mean? It's not, it's like, say, people are either good or they're not good. If there's people trying to be good, well, it's a bit of a waste of time because you're either good or you're not good. You know what I mean? And again, this is the way all the institutional churches and religions go. You go, well, you've got to be good and you've got to do A, B, and C to be good. And there's another thing that's connected to this. I think it was a phrase, and I'm only paraphrasing it by Thomas Hardy, the writer. But it goes. The gist of it really is the people who do the wrong thing know an awful lot more about the right thing than the people who do the right things all the time.
Ooh,
And
okay.
F.M. Alexander, who was the person from which the Alexander technique emanated, used to have that in his office, I think. So, there's lots of layers of stuff in this that you will never ever hear discussed on the radio and mainstream. And this is the other thing, by the way, that I wanted to say about the film. It's going back to an earlier question of yours to say, what was I hoping to get from this film? I mean, Alan and myself discussed many times along the way that what we really wanted to do was give an opportunity for the discourse on this whole matter to change. Because the discourse at present in the mainstream media is survivors stroke victims, and I don't like the word victims like any. And I mean, I would like to see myself as a survivor, but I was a victim as well. So it's not that it's a wrong word. And then there's the perpetrators. And never the twain shall meet. Hang this guy up by his toenails from, you know what I mean, and look after the survivor, which is exactly what needs to happen. The survivor does need to be looked after and helped in every possible way to come through the things that they need to come through in order to become whole and human, vital humans again. But I don't think it's a case of just, shooting the perpetrators. Again, people aren't saying that everything. There are quite a few things where people work with perpetrators. That does exist in the world, and there's things like restorative justice. And I think our film, The Meeting, shows restorative justice in its best way. But the discourse. That's what I'm saying. We wanted to try and help to change the discourse from being just a dual thing. Never the twain shall meet. And you see, the other thing as well is I didn't go through any legal process. Because if I went through a legal process, my lawyer would hire a counsel, and that counsel would meet the counsel hired by the lawyer of the institution from whence I was abused. And I would never, ever meet the people who I need to meet. But I'm making moves, and I've already made some moves to do that. And that's working out very well. And I'm seeing a completely different picture than I might have otherwise. So that's a whole other, there's the discourse, which is very binary in the public domain, and then there's the legal process. The criminal justice system obviously is necessary for all sorts of reasons, and I have nothing against the law per se, but I do have problems with the law and the criminal justice system when it comes to sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, and I have dealt with that in my own way, and that's all clear, from the film and everything. But it's a difficult thing to do because we all have to say, well, the legal system, yeah, but it means it's really the only thing we have, isn't it? This sort of stuff. I'm saying, fuck all that. Like, let's go a little bit deeper into everything and let's get honest.
And having been through all of this and experienced this, what are your thoughts on the issue of evil? Like, do you have any perspective on it? Do you think evil exists in the world? Do you think this is a real thing, legitimate thing?
Absolutely. And not only that, I've been through this quite a lot now myself, and it is a really important question. I have evil and good in me, myself. So I'm not even worried about does evil exist? Of course it does. And this is what I was saying that Richard Rohr was saying recently as well, is that, evil hides itself very well kind of in plain sight within the collective. So again, if you look at say, just this is one instance perhaps, let's just say, and I mightn't be 100% right about this, but say there's any particular institution or a church, and somebody is found to have been interfering sexually with the child, that person is looked upon as sexually deviant and is then punished from within, right? Which automatically relieves that institution itself from any um, responsibility from this. See? And this is happening all the
Yes.
time. Whereas what we've got to do is come back and look at the collective. But like I said, Mark Twain very, very astutely said, it's much easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. But the collective, once they have been fooled, it's almost impossible to get them to see that they've been fooled. That happened after Hitler was even in the bunker in Germany at the end of the war. People still couldn't see and admit that they had done something horrific. Maybe that has yet to happen in some of the stuff that's happening right now. But it's always happening on the macro level in the same way that it's happening on the micro level. But we somehow conveniently only deal with the micro level to make it look like we're doing something about it. Does that make sense?
It does. It
Oh, yeah.
does.
But this is a whole new discourse that's, this is very live. These are the kind of things that I think about any given day. Like,
What comes to mind for me, and I don't know why, but is that how well we do in life and our ability to heal and grow, a large part of that depends on us having the capacity to look at the things sometimes that we really don't want to look at. And you've done that in your own life by addressing your own suffering, but also now in recognizing that we all have evil within us and sort of holding these two truths in mind, like, so but before we wrap, just one last question, then I suppose, like, what do you think about this instinct towards truth in life? Is that something you've ever given any consideration to?
oh yeah, completely. I think it's a natural instinct of every human being to go towards that. So what I think about now is, and again, William Blake a long, long time ago would have said, everything that lives is holy. Life delights in life. James Joyce said, love loves to love. And these are people who gave a lot of thought to this sort of stuff. So I believe them, that they've, and isn't it a beautiful thing? So this is what they're doing. They're talking about that instinct towards truth. And the ultimate truth is love. We keep being told it, like, but and of course, I wake up some mornings full of it. Like this morning, I woke up. I'll tell you, this is the truth. I woke up this morning with this real sense that because I was out walking yesterday and I saw the bog near me, and I know that it's completely alive. It looks like a flat bog, but it's completely alive, full of living things, all sorts of stuff. You might hear a pheasant screeching or something, and then that's even, and that's a big thing, but there's millions of small things. But it's in a constant, especially around spring, it's continually growing, right? So I wake up this morning and say, Jesus, yeah, that's the way. And I actually woke up that way this morning, thanks be to God, because I'm doing this podcast today. But yesterday morning, I woke up thinking, Jesus God. And it took me about a half an hour to be kind of anyway positive about anything I was full of, And this is why I think the evil and the good is always working kind of between us. But truth is made up of evil and good becoming somehow balanced into some, wrangled into some sort of homeostasis, so that then we're capable maybe of love, which is our initial instinct.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on, Tomas. I've enjoyed every minute of this, and I think you've shared some incredible insights. So I want to say thank you so much. Um, if you get a chance, I would really recommend watching the Days of Trees documentary. It's an experience. You're really going there for something that is, yeah, that's what I'd say. It's an experience, and you've also
Like
got
when you say that now, I have to really say, because this isn't all I said, but like the people who worked on the Days of Trees with me, everything from the music, the sound, the editing, an amazing crew, a very small crew, but an amazing crew. That's what makes that experience that you've just described there. Not me, like, that's the truth.
yeah. And you've also got the meeting and meetings with Ivor as well. Is that right?
Driver, yeah. And like if you go on the website for the Days of Trees, it's just www.daysofTrees, like all one word, daysofTrees.com. And then at the bottom of that, you'll see all of the stuff relating to the Days of Trees. Like thankfully, it won, which is amazing because only very few people have seen it. But it won an IFTA award for best documentary last year, up against the Netflix ones and everything. And of course, Alan and myself were delighted, because our budget was probably about the same as one of the opening sequences of one of the bigger Netflix ones. There were other small films, brilliant films in the category with us as well, but that happened. And that sort of a thing helps me no end in terms of saying, well, did you do the right thing, Tomas? Because I often said to myself, you clown, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing exposing yourself? You'll never be, you'll never get out of this one. But I'm getting out of it really well, I think. And it's still only beginning. This is the beginning of a story as opposed to the end of it, because as a society we have a long way to go in this, But anyway,
Well,
meetings with Ivory, you can see it on the website. If you scroll down, you click, and you'll get into the websites for both of those films as well.
for sure. Well, you've done something right given the reaction you've got, and Gabor Maté spoke very highly of it as well. And if someone doing his kind of work and the experience he's had, for him to say that is really high praise.
That was
So,
really helpful that Gabor did that, and he was very generous about it. Yeah.
but anyway, Thomas, I want to wish you all the best with your work going forward, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
Thank you, Niall, and I'll continue to listen to the Weekend University podcast. I won't be listening to this one, but I'll listen and looking forward to the rest. And thank you to everybody who's been part of this with you. It's been a great learning platform for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Tomas.
Thanks.